In the 10th century, Europe had a problem. It had too many knights. Not too many in the sense of being inconveniently well defended. Too many in the sense of armed professional soldiers with no particular reason to behave themselves between wars. The church tried twice to legally restrict what they could do and who they could do it to. Both times it failed completely. What they came up with instead was chivalry, which was not an ideal, it was a management strategy. Chivalry. You probably think you know what it means. Holding doors open, paying for dinner, dying dramatically on a horse for someone who didn't ask you to. It's one of those words that gets used constantly and defined almost never. Deployed in arguments, invoked at dinner tables, printed on motivational posters in places that really should know better. Everyone has a rough sense of it. Hardly anyone could tell you where it actually came from. Which is convenient, because the actual history of where it came from is, and we say this with great affection for the medieval period, absolutely mental. The short version. Chivalry was not ancient. It was not instinctive. It was not the natural expression of noble warriors who had simply always known how to behave. It was invented, largely by accident, during 2 centuries of religiously motivated warfare in the Middle East, by an institution that had spent the previous 100 years begging knights to please, for the love of God, stop robbing peasants. Before the Crusades, before the poems, before any of it, what actually was a knight? Not the version from the paintings, not the gleaming figure on a white horse, noble of bearing, pure of heart, riding off to protect the innocent. That version came later. That version is, in fact, most of what we're here to talk about. The real answer, the historical answer, is considerably less romantic. A knight was a man with a horse, a sword, and no particular reason to be nice about either. Professional fighters, hired out to lords and bishops and ambitious counts with a land dispute and a bad attitude. They were expensive to maintain. The cost of a war horse alone was roughly equivalent to several years of a peasant's income, and they were difficult to control. And when there wasn't a war on, they had a habit of finding something to do with themselves anyway. But scent was usually not good for whoever lived nearby. The knights in 10th and 11th century Europe operated with a level of impunity that is difficult to overstate. They owed loyalty to their lord, and broadly speaking, that was the extent of their ethical obligations. Outside of that relationship, the average knight had very little framework for how he was supposed to behave, and a great deal of capacity for behaving badly. The church, the same institution that would later sanctify knighthood, bless its swords, and wrap the whole enterprise in holy purpose, spent the better part of the 10th century trying to legally prevent these men from attacking unarmed civilians. In 999, they launched the Peace of God, a church council movement that prohibited violence against clergy, pilgrims, merchants, and peasants. Bishops across France gathered, declared these groups off limits, and asked knights to swear oaths of protection over holy relics. Not as a philosophical position, not as an aspirational ideal, as a response to something that was actively, repeatedly happening. Then came the Truce of God, which didn't even try to restrict who knights could attack, just when. No fighting on Sundays, no fighting on holy days, no fighting during Lent or Advent. The church was essentially attempting to introduce office hours for brutality. Neither movement worked especially well. Knights swore oaths and broke them. Bishops threatened excommunication and were ignored. The violence continued with its usual enthusiasm. But these movements tell you everything you need to know about where chivalry actually starts. Not with noble warriors who needed an ideal to aspire to. Not with a culture that already understood honor and simply required a name for it. It starts with dangerous men who needed to be managed, and an institution that was running out of ideas for how to do it. Then, in 1095, Pope Urban II stood up at the Council of Clermont and changed the entire calculus. He told the assembled nobility that Jerusalem, the holiest city in Christendom, was in the hands of enemies of Christ, that Christian pilgrims were being prevented from accessing the holy sites, that the Eastern Church was under threat, and that any man who took the cross, who picked up his sword and his horse, and marched east to defend the faith, would receive full absolution for his sins. All of them. Every sin cleared. He didn't ask them to become different men. He didn't ask them to put down the violence or renounce the life they'd built around it. He told them that the violence, the very thing the church had spent a century trying to contain, was now pointed in the right direction. A form of worship. You didn't have to stop being what you were. You just had to aim yourself at a different target. For knights who had spent their careers sinning professionally and confessing periodically, this was a remarkable offer. The chronicles describe the crowd at Clermont responding with a single shout, "Dare vult! God will it!" And then, over the following months, something extraordinary happened. They actually went. The First Crusade drew hundreds of thousands of people into a journey that most of them would not survive. Many walked, many had no military training, many died of disease and starvation before they ever saw a battlefield. The road to Constantinople alone was littered with the dead. But for the knights, the professional soldiers for whom this was, in theory, exactly what they'd been trained for, something had permanently shifted. The knight now had a theological identity, a sacred purpose that sat above and beyond the paycheck, above the feudal obligation, above the specific lord he happened to serve. Violence consecrated. The warrior sanctified. That is the foundation on which chivalry would be built. Not honor for its own sake, not a code that emerged naturally from the noble heart of the fighting man. Honor as a framework constructed around sacred violence, designed, functionally, to make dangerous men feel that what they were doing was righteous, and in doing so, to give the church some purchase on how they did it. Now here is where it gets genuinely interesting. The Crusaders went east expecting, one imagines, to find enemies. What they found instead were enemies with a more sophisticated military culture than their own. This is not a comfortable fact, historically speaking, and it was not a comfortable fact for the Crusaders either. The Islamic world in the 11th and 12th centuries was, by most measurable standards, more literate, more scientifically advanced, and more culturally refined than the Latin West. Its courts were centers of philosophy, mathematics, poetry, and medicine. Its military tradition carried its own codes of conduct, its own ideals of the warrior. The concept of Furusiyya, a term roughly translatable as a kind of noble virtue or martial chivalry, had existed in Islamic culture for centuries before the First Crusade. It emphasized courage, yes, but also generosity, protection of the weak, restraint toward enemies who had surrendered. A warrior who embodied Furusiyya was not simply a good fighter, he was a good man who happened to fight. The Crusaders encountered this in negotiations, in the conduct of battles, in the treatment of prisoners. And then in 1187, they encountered it in its most visible and undeniable form. Saladin retook Jerusalem. The city had been in Crusader hands since 1099, taken in a siege that ended with a massacre the chroniclers themselves described with some discomfort. When Saladin took it back, he did not reciprocate. He negotiated terms, he allowed the Christian population to ransom their freedom, he returned holy relics, he granted safe passage to those who could not pay. There are accounts of him personally covering ransoms for the poor out of his own treasury. European chroniclers, men writing explicitly from the perspective of his enemies, wrote about Saladin with barely concealed admiration. He appeared in Western literature not as a villain, but as a figure of gravity and honor. He became, in the European imagination, a kind of honorary knight, the perfect warrior, tragically on the wrong side of the theological line. And the qualities they admired in him, mercy in victory, restraint in power, a kind of grave and dignified conduct, quietly folded themselves into the European template for what a Christian knight was supposed to look like. Nobody announced this. There was no papal document saying, "We've reviewed the enemy's honor code and would like to incorporate several elements." It simply happened, gradually through cultural contact and the uncomfortable business of admiring people you're supposed to be fighting. The ideal absorbed the influence and forgot to credit the source. By the 12th century, the Troubadours had got hold of it, and the whole enterprise went fully commercial. Troubadours were poet-musicians, mostly from southern France and the courts of Aquitaine and Provence. They were professionals, composers and performers who depended on aristocratic patronage, which meant they were very good at telling aristocrats what they wanted to hear. What they produced was courtly love poetry. And what courtly love poetry did was take the martial ideal, the sacred warrior, the consecrated sword, and attach it to a romantic narrative that made the whole thing not just admirable, but desirable, fashionable, something you'd want to be seen participating in. The ideal knight of the troubadour tradition was ferocious in battle and tremblingly devoted in love. He dedicated his prowess to a noblewoman, usually someone else's wife, which added a pleasing tension to proceedings and proved his worth through increasingly elaborate feats of loyalty and suffering. Love in this tradition was not a pleasant domestic arrangement. It was a spiritual discipline, a form of self-improvement conducted via the medium of unrequited longing. This was not ancient tradition being faithfully recorded. This was new content, produced by professionals for an audience that wanted to believe they were participating in something timeless and noble. And it landed with extraordinary force. Knights began hold tournaments specifically framed as chivalric performance, not just tests of martial skill, but public demonstrations of honor, courtesy, and devotion. Orders of knighthood developed elaborate rituals and oaths that codified the ideal into formal obligation. The mythology became the culture, became the social expectation. By the 13th century, a knight who behaved like a 10th century knight, which is to say like a man with a horse, a sword, and no particular ethical commitments, was not just sinful. He was embarrassing, he was letting the side down, he had failed to live up to something that a mere 200 years earlier had not existed. The Crusades ended. The ideal didn't. What those 2 centuries of warfare produced, unintentionally, incrementally, through theological necessity and cultural contact and the commercial instincts of French poets, was Western civilization's most enduring template for honorable manhood, the knight in shining armor, the code of the noble warrior, the whole romantic mythology that would run through European literature and art for the next 8 centuries, and hasn't entirely stopped running yet. We still use the word chivalry, stripped now of crusades and consecrated violence and the elaborate machinery of courtly love, reduced to whether someone holds a door open or picks up a bill at dinner. The branding campaign outlasted the product by nearly a millennium. The church set out to stop knights burning villages. They launched 2 reform movements that failed, backed a military campaign that was morally catastrophic, and accidentally produced Western civilization's defining image of the honorable man, which is either a remarkable achievement or a deeply funny one, probably both. If this is the kind of history you're here for, the accidental, the contradictory, the bits that got left out of the textbook because they complicate the story, subscribe. It takes 4 seconds and tells the algorithm you have taste, which is increasingly rare and worth rewarding.